Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Casa Italiana zerilli-marimò. My name is Eugenio Refini. I'm the chair of the Department of Italian Studies, and I'm really delighted to welcome you all tonight for a very special event. We are very fortunate to have with us two wonderful artists. I'm a big fan of both of them, and they're also extremely sort of kind individuals, which never hurts, especially these days. I think kindness and empathy is crucial to our living together, and certainly crucial to both of them do in terms of their work. So I will keep the introduction very short because we all want to hear from them, and they're also very well known, so I don't need to go through the entire elements of their careers. We have the pleasure of having with us tonight countertenor Anthony Roth Costanzo, who's actually back to Casa Italiana after 11 years. I was reminded by our Casa director, Stefano Albertini, that the video of that visit is available on the website, so feel free to check it out. So Anthony is a world-renowned singer, a star. He's been performing across opera, concert, film, and Broadway since age 11. That's very important detail. He's been appointed in 2024 as the general director and president of Opera Philadelphia, so adding yet another hat to the many hats he's already wearing. He's performed with major opera houses, including the Metropolitan Opera, of course, Lyric Opera of Chicago, the English National Opera. He's appeared with orchestras, including the New York Phil, London Symphony Orchestra. He is also a recorded artist, of course. I will mention two things. One beautiful, extremely delightful album, Only an Octave Apart, which I strongly recommend to everybody. Especially, this is a series where we talk about voice in various ways and broadly meant, and that album is of extreme interest in that respect, because it's all about, what we think about voices, vocal registers in unpredictable ways. But he's also a recorded artist as part of a big project, which was the Akhnaten, the very famous opera, which got him a Grammy. I'm sure that many people saw him in the role of Akhnaten at the Metropolitan Opera a few years ago. He's also a champion of new music. He's premiered works by leading composers, and he's been curating projects of various kinds for the BBC Proms, the New York Phil. He has won numerous awards, including the Beverly Sills Award and Operalia. He's been a student at Princeton and the Manhattan School of Music, and he serves on multiple boards across the globe, actually, and he's been the recipient of fellowships from Oxford, Harvard, and I will just stop it here in the interest of time. I will also be very brief about the other special guest we have tonight with us, Sarah Ruhl, who's an award-winning playwright, author, librettist, and professor. She's a two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist. She has many plays. I've just cherry-picked a few titles. The Oldest Boy in the Next Room, or the Vibrator play, which is one of the Pulitzer finalist titles. The Clean House, Passion Play, Dead Man's Cell Phone, Demeter in the City, Scenes from Court Life, and I will mention two more works which are particularly dear to me. Eurydice, we will talk a little bit about it tonight, and Orlando. I'm particularly happy to mention her adaptation of Orlando from Virginia Woolf's play, because that's what, in a way, allowed us to kind of get together, because last year I was teaching Orlando with my students, and she was gracious enough to come and visit the class, and we had a wonderful conversation. And that's where the idea of this event tonight kind of started, because we started to talk about common interests, and she at some point mentioned a project she was working with Anthony, which had to do with baroque opera, Vivaldi, and then I said, okay, that's the perfect cocktail for something to be done down here at Casa Italiana. She has received numerous honors, including a MacArthur Fellowship, a Penn Center Award, the Steinberg Distinguished Playwright Award. She has an MFA from Brown University, and she teaches at Yale School of Drama, and is the author also of a memoir, Smile, a very beautiful and touching book, which was the People Best Book of the Year when it came out, I think in 2022. That's correct, yeah. So please join me in welcoming Anthony Roth Costanzo and Sarah Ruhl. Okay, so as I said, one of the reasons why I really wanted to have these artists tonight with us is really their common interests in two main areas, which are also of interest to me. One of these areas is the relationship with the past, and in particular with classical mythology. You both have had a lot to do with the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice in different ways, for different reasons. The play Eurydice by Sarah is coming back to New York this spring, April and May. So make sure to save a date to see it up at Signature Theater. Anthony has been interpreting the role of Orfeo in Gluck's Orfeo de Eurydice. I think the last time was last spring, 1 year ago at the Met, a very touching performance in the Mark Morris production. So I think they both have had a lot of time spent with the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. And I would like to really begin from here, because this is such a foundational myth in global culture, so to speak. And the kind of question I would like to start is really, what is this myth continuing to tell us? And why are we still drawn towards the tragic story of Orpheus and Eurydice?
Well, thanks for having us and the nice introduction. And I, I don't know. I mean, it's such a profound story about loss and heartbreak, and how opaque it can be, how opaque our reasons can be to ourselves and to others. Why did Orpheus turn? We don't really know. Was he compelled because he was afraid and he wasn't sure she was following him? Did he just want to see her face and had bad timing? And then in my version, she says his name, and that's what makes him turn around. Why did she say his name? Did she want to sabotage it? Was she unsure? Did she want to see his face? I mean, I purposely don't answer the questions, because I think that's what makes it so compelling, is that there's a layer of abstraction that allows us all to heave our personal heartbreak into this much larger container. Anthony?
I mean, one thing I love about Sarah's play is that Orpheus is actually quite self-centered and not really the protagonist. And so one thing that appeals to me about this role, and when you play a character, you have to find what appeals to you in a way, is that he uses his music to open doors, both literally and figuratively. And his voice, and that idea of voice as identity and voice as power, and things that we're still connected with in today's world, I think comes out of this Orpheus myth. He goes to the underworld and he wants them to open the gates, and it's his singing that doesn't force them to with power, but rather it melts their hearts and they open the gates. So I think that's really interesting. But one point of connection before we actually started working together was that I had been working with Matthew Aucoin, the composer, and one of the first things he wrote for me was a cantata, so about a 20-minute piece, and it was the moment when Orpheus turns. And it was as if that moment were frozen, and we went inside Orpheus's head, and he wrote his own text for it. And what was really interesting was he toyed with the idea of the fact that when he lost Eurydice the first time, his music had become so beautiful that it could open the gates. If he lost her a second time, would it make his music that much more beautiful? And I think that's, in a way, that kind of thinking really jives with Sarah's version, which then Matt went on to set as an opera. And so, yeah, I think there's this sense of the mistake, which is also very universal. I think we all feel that we are in certain moments making these mistakes, or we put that onus on ourselves, or we see mistakes in other people. And as Sarah says, this mistake is so hard to understand where it comes from and how in a split second it could change the entire story.
Well, I mean, this is already a lot to sort of digest and think about, and it actually made me think of one particular detail in the story, which I actually sort of got to pay attention to listening to you singing Orfeo last year. You know, we all know the famous arias in the beautiful Gluck's opera. Che farò senza Eurydice is one of the most well-known arias ever. But actually, I think at some point I realized that there's another moment when Orfeo is really trying to get through hell, through the gate, and what wins the Furies over is that moment when Orfeo says, you know, you should understand me because I bring hell in my heart. L'inferno ho in mezzo al cuore, right? L'inferno mio. And that's when they kind of, again, get into this moment of empathy, right? And it's such a beautiful moment of music. And, you know, a little underrated because in a way we all wait for other moments in the opera, but that's such a key passage both in the text and in the music. And then I thought, you know, this is a moment when we do even get to see the surroundings in a different way. And of course, Inferno, Hell, is a very special place as it comes through in Gluck's opera, but also in Sarah's play. And I'm wondering whether, you know, you have something to say about this. I mean, what is the appeal, if I can say so, of the context of the story? I mean, to relate to it, because it seems remote, but at the same time, it's very close to everybody's heart.
Well, I think wanting it to be accessible and present and contemporary was one of the reasons I wanted to write about it. And so I set it in kind of, for me, just the place of memory, which is sort of my grandparents' time. So it begins with them on the beach, Orpheus and Eurydice, and the stage directions say they're wearing bathing suits from the 1950s, which is an awful stage direction for any actress to contemplate, really. And later I thought, God, why did I put the actress through that? That's terrible. Why should she have to appear in a bathing suit in the first scene? But I realized the reason I did it was I didn't want it to be now, but I didn't want it to be in Greek kind of antiquity or in kind of overly classical time. I wanted it to be in a place of memory that felt like memory, but close enough to now, where they might be, you know, going to Williamsburg and getting vintage, you know, bathing suits. So that slight slippage. And you asked about the container, why, like the container of hell? I mean, there's so many hells. I feel like we're living in one now in this country. And hell is so subjective in a way. And I remember when I wrote the play when I was 25 in graduate school. And I brought it in, and my professor said, hell should really be the inside of the Cincinnati airport. And there should be two guys in the back taking their eyeballs out slowly and putting them back in. And I loved this professor, but I thought, well, then it would be your play if I had that. But there's so many ways to conceive of hell. And Mary Zimmerman, who directed the Met's opera version, I was talking to her recently, and she said, you know, if it hadn't been the first production, I might have made hell be a dentist's office, you know, a waiting room. But because it was the first, I wanted to put on stage what I thought you had written, which I really appreciated, and I think is a good mark of a director who's birthing a new piece.
Yeah, and I appreciate you zeroing in on that one piece of music. Just from an operatic interpretation point of view, this is where you know, the singer sometimes has to fight, and I really had to fight for that one page of music because often it's done quite quickly, and I don't think that's how it should be done. However, it was intended to be done, because it often just goes by, and actually it's a very beautiful harmony. So I fought for it to be quite slow, hoping that someone would hear it and go, "Oh my gosh, I love that part of the music." So I'm happy that you did. But yes,
Who'd you have to fight?
The conductor, and you know, probably other people too, but like Mark Morris, and you know, but the good thing about being a singer, where you have very little control until you're on stage, and if you start slowing down and they don't accommodate you, they look bad. Yeah, so it's a little bit of a dance. No, but we did agree on it, and we found the right tempo, and I think that this idea of feeling each other's pain is also fundamental to art, you know, and if I zoom way out, the idea that Orpheus represents in some aspect, you know, what music and art can do, and their limits as well. And of course, beyond Gluck's opera, you have Orpheus's head floating down a river singing, and there's other parts of the Orpheus myth. So, you know, the idea that music and art allows us to feel one another's pain, I think is both a very good thing and a very bad thing in some ways.
Thank you. One other thing which is, I think, of great interest, of course, whenever we talk about this particular myth, is that, again, history has been focusing mostly on Orpheus, right? I mean, and most of the traditional operas do have a lot of singing for Orfeo and just a few things, beautiful, even in the case of Gluck, but just a few things for Eurydice. And then, of course, one of the aims of Sarah's work was to try to sort of focus the story and trying to give Eurydice a brighter space, a broader space. And of course, this can be read in many different ways, but I'm curious to ask, you know, what was your primary goal with this rereading of the myth through the character of Eurydice? And then for Anthony, how did an experience such, you know, the one represented by Sarah's play and the opera, has affected your way of thinking about Orfeo in your own work on him?
Well, I mean, as a woman writing, it frustrated me that all of the interpretations of Orpheus just saw Eurydice as this kind of cipher. And I felt like she was sort of veiled in literally and figuratively. And so I wanted to give her more of a voice. And I feel like as a playwright, you're not supposed to say the character is me. And of course, the character is not me because I didn't die twice. And there's so many ways in which the character is not me, but there are many ways in which the character is me. My father had died shortly before I wrote it, and it was a way to imagine that I could go into the underworld and speak with him again. So I also feel like I should say, because we didn't say this, that Anthony, when we did the first sing through of Matt's opera, and there was just one act, Anthony was singing the countertenor role, which is Orpheus's double, and that's how we met. And I thought, who is this person? And then you weren't able to do it when we did it, but yeah.
Yeah, and I also was like, I want to work with that person. And also, you know, obviously artistically, but there is a kind of being people together in a room, which we can talk about too, which is an important part of making art, as it turns out, in addition to the creative output. I think that there's a lot of different ways to play Orpheus, and it goes back to putting yourself into it like you do as a playwright, and also finding distance for yourself. But I think that to the extent to which there's any melodrama in my portrayal of Orpheus, it makes it more about him. And to the extent to which there's more honesty and actual experience of sadness that you find in the music, which is why I'm always fighting for this music to have a little bit more time to feel sad and not be so, sung through, I guess, I think means that we can make it feel more real, and that she is present for him, because in the opera she doesn't show up until Act 3 basically, and so I try and find these ways to make her present. And in fact, there's ornamentation you can do in Baroque opera, meaning you add your own decorations vocally. And in one of the cadenzas of this strophic aria, where he's trying to hear her echo, I have him actually repeat the same line he sings in a cadenza as her echo, which I just added in so that she is there with him. And so rather than it all being about him feeling his suffering, you're trying to actually picture her.
It is so beautiful, and the echo example kind of really lead, unwillingly to another question which I had, which is this notion of you both in different ways again working on quite often on things which come from the past, right? I mean, either reinventing a story, rewriting a story, or performing operas, arias which come from periods way back in time. And one of the fascinating but also frustrating things about all this notion of working with the past is that we are dealing with something which is apparently lost, right? I mean, of course, the Greek past is still present in a way, but is lost. The voice of Orpheus, whatever that sounded like, is lost. We can recapture these kind of things through the performing arts in interesting ways. And so I'm wondering whether you can speak to this particular relationship to the work you do with the past, and to what extent your work as a playwright and as a performer, as a singer, kind of allowed you to maybe get a less frustrated relationship to the past, or maybe more frustrated, I don't know.
One thing I always think a lot about is this idea of authenticity, which comes up in relationship to the past. And in music, we often are trying to be as authentic as possible. They tune to 423 megahertz or whatever it is. And so our A is slightly lower if we're doing this piece, or it's slightly higher. We get really obsessed with the physical authenticity. If a string is made out of animal gut rather than synthetic, or that kind of thing. And of course, there's a way in which that brings us closer to the past. But the authenticity that I get most concerned with is the composer created something that made an audience feel a certain way. And so what would we have to do today without changing the work to make an audience feel an equivalent way for this time and for this audience? And so that is an aspect of authenticity that I don't think is talked about. And in classical music, what can be frustrating is that you feel the more knowledge you have, the better it is. And the more, precision and perfection and knowledge that you put into something, the more value it has. But actually, I'm more interested in the value that speaks to an audience. And of course, I don't want to let go of any rigor or tradition or technique, but it has to be used in the service of an authentic experience for me. So that's, and the past has a lot to teach us about that, but it doesn't mean that we have to replicate it necessarily.
I totally agree. And I think that's one reason I wrote Eurydice is I was interested in Greek tragedy, but also interested in how opaque it could feel when I saw Greek tragedy performed. I remember going with a lawyer friend, who's a human rights lawyer, and we went to, I don't know, some Greek tragedy at BAM, and she was like, why is the chorus speaking at the same time? It was so opaque to her, even just that. And I felt like if it was supposed to rip your heart and soul out and make you faint and cry back then, how could it feel contemporary now? And I guess there's a way in which I've never felt totally at home in the contemporary moment and felt maybe 150 to 300 years behind, and thought the customs of the contemporary moment were weird. And so the past is very fertile and alive to me through reading, always has been. And in a way, because I don't love realism that much in the theater, the past as a canvas was really delightful to me because we don't totally know how people sounded when they spoke. So I felt like I could make it up.
Yeah. Which is also, I think, a very liberating approach to the past without being necessarily against it, or without being, not philological. I mean, there's a way of doing philology and spending time with reconstructing the past, which doesn't prevent us from relating emotionally to it. And it seems that this is also crucial to whatever notion of adaptation and rewriting we are dealing with. I remember one of the things which my students in my class last year were struck about when we were reading Orlando by Virginia Woolf, and then we went through the play by Sarah, and then we went to see the show, the notion of time, right? And of course, Virginia Woolf already does a lot with it, but I think in your play, you sort of make it even more, I mean, not more explicit, but certainly you make a point about it. The fact that we are dealing with something which is very subjective and which we receive in a way, but which is up to us to make present. So I think there's this kind of tension between past, present, and how we sort of revive one through the other. I don't know whether you have other thoughts about. I mean, I'm kind of obsessed, of course, with this notion of time and how the arts and the performing arts in particular allows us to reconnect with something with which we actually cannot fully reconnect. And I'm thinking of Anthony in this case in particular because as a countertenor, you kind of work not only but mostly with kind of a repertoire which comes not only from a different time period but also from a kind of voice, the castrati in particular, of which we don't really have strong evidence, right? I mean, we are kind of really moving in uncharted territories when we think about these voices from only maybe 3-4 centuries ago, but still kind of gone.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the castrati are a fascinating phenomenon. I'm writing a book right now about the history of the countertenor, which of course goes to this idea of men who were castrated. And in the prime of this phenomenon, from about the mid 17th century to the mid 18th century, 4,000 boys a year were being castrated in Italy alone. And so it was really quite widespread and quite prevalent among opera and music. Vivaldi and Handel and Mozart and Gluck and all of these composers were writing for castrati. We wouldn't have opera today if it weren't for castrati. So, but what did that mean in terms of ideas of perception, right? And when it comes to gender, when it comes to identity, when it comes to voice, when it comes to artifice and reality, what was so fascinating about this voice, and what is so fascinating about a male who sings in a high voice? And one thing my book looks at is how from the time we're children listening to Elmo and Mickey Mouse, who are speaking in a falsetto, to our teenage years listening to Michael Jackson or the Bee Gees or whatever we listen to, we're surrounded by falsetto, and every culture in the world has their version of it, in China, in Japan, in Hawaii. So, what is so fascinating historically about that, and yet simultaneously uncomfortable or dissonant about that relationship? And so certainly, I think I always refer to the time of the castrati in the past as a time that in my mind, gender was a much looser thing in many ways than it has become now, especially in its politicization. But also it involved a kind of mutilation that might or might not have been voluntary. It's hard to say because it happened in children who were under 13. So it's a very complicated thing to unpack, and you don't exactly want to celebrate it, but it certainly has had an impact on art.
It was just so beautifully said, both of you. I have nothing to add.
Right. Well, so we won't get into the Orlando rabbit hole tonight.
Oh, well,
but of course, that could be another. I mean, if you want to say something, I'm always very happy to hear about that particular perspective.
I mean, I would love to do an opera version of Orlando for Anthony, for one thing.
Well, then.
It's our next project.
The next project.
We needed one because we're just
I
finishing
know, we're
this.
finishing. Yeah. I mean, I think Woolf is such a master of parsing time as it moves. And I mean, her sort of contribution to modernism in terms of finding the moment and trying to arrest the subjective moment is endlessly beautiful to me. And Orlando does that by first taking you on this journey through centuries. So, and centuries pass in an instant. She slows time down, she speeds time up, she arrests time. She has her protagonist change gender in the midst of time. So Woolf was just light years ahead in terms of thinking about gender, transformation, time, identity, probably quantum physics too,
Yeah.
though I don't know if she had,
Yeah. Oh,
not
that's very, I mean,
consciously.
this is so fascinating, really, because it's kind of transformation writ large. I mean, it's just this very capacious notion of things which change and evolve, and this has to do with basically everything. And that particular novel, of course, is a wonderful textbook. But speaking of collaborations, now that we know that there might be an Orlando project in the making sometime soon, hopefully, I would like to maybe move to your actual sort of way of working together, because you're just recently did this opera in Boston, The Seasons, which is an opera based on music. Well, I mean, it's an opera with music by Vivaldi, with a new libretto by Sarah, but it's really a collaboration of the two in the conception of the opera. It's an opera about the weather, it's an opera about climate change, and about many other anxieties which are kind of very urgent and timely today, and yet again working with materials which come from this fairly distant past. So maybe we can begin by sort of talking about how the project kind of was born and how did it come about.
Well, it started with Anthony and Anthony wanting to do a Baroque pastiche, and we talked about it. We talked about Vivaldi, and I can't remember if the Four Seasons was part of it at that point.
Yeah, maybe.
I
I
don't
think
know.
we started without it, and then
Yeah, well, I mean, I grew up in Illinois. I was not terribly well versed in opera, but we did have a cassette tape of Vivaldi's Four Seasons that we play in the Buick on car trips. And so I sort of had it memorized. And I always thought it would be interesting to think about Vivaldi's relationship to poetry, because there were sonnets that went along with the Four Seasons, and think about the poetry of the Four Seasons now, which to me had to be disordered because the weather is disordered. So my first pitch to Anthony was something to do with the Four Seasons, but disordered. And we talked about dance during the seasons, and Anthony had the idea to bring on Pam Tanowitz, who's an amazing choreographer. And then as we went deeper and thought about story, the story I came up with was 5 artists going to a barn thinking that they'd be inspired by the beauty of nature. And Anthony and I probably both have been to these kinds of retreats where you meet artists who are some degree of self-absorbed and want to make their art and be inspired by the beauty of nature. And in this version, they fall in love, they're inspired for a bit, but then the nature gets so extreme, they can't really be inspired by nature anymore. And as I went deeper into looking at Vivaldi, because I was a total neophyte in terms of Vivaldi operas, it was fascinating to me that so many of the melodies for the Four Seasons were woven through other arias. So anyway, that's
yeah, and we what we decided to do is take some of these arias that are so beautiful and weave them together with pieces from the Four Seasons, and we didn't exactly change the libretto of the opera of the arias. We rather Sarah would come up with a different way of putting it, but inspired by the original text. And then there were new recitatives that were set to original Vivaldi recitatives, and everything started to fit together. And Sarah, of course, wrote things that were unspoken, as you do in plays, stage directions that would describe dance and tell a whole, story arc. And it was actually, I imagine, quite a difficult assignment to write it, really using very few words, a whole story that connected these disparate pieces of music. But the overall impact, I think, which is really exciting, is to make something which connects our emotion to the weather in the same way Vivaldi connected the weather to music, and that in this context of the climate that we know is politically important and is dire and all of these things, it's one thing in a cerebral realm and it's another in an emotional realm, and I think this piece endeavors to go into the latter.
And I mean, and the result was truly beautiful. I really enjoyed it when I got to see it, and I think that this question of bringing together climate, weather, emotion, and of course through the filter of Vivaldi's own way of dealing with all that, brings us back again to the question of us and them, right? I mean, we are redoing something which in a way was meaningful to someone like Vivaldi and his own audience, but also you were doing something very experimental and yet something which it was very peculiar to the time period of Vivaldi himself. And the pastiche as a genre is something which composers and librettists at the time would be doing on a fairly regular basis. So I think something which is interesting to explore perhaps is your way of playing with a genre, the pastiche, in new ways, but which as a genre was already part of the same culture you were drawing from.
Yeah, completely. And one thing that was interesting was even just dealing with the Italian. There was a point where we thought, oh, well, let's just leave all the arias in Italian and try to tell the story with only dance and recit. And then we thought, we need some English to get some story in the aria. And so then we came up with this sort of strange hybrid where there would be some Italian and then you telescope in for maybe the da capo section, which would be in English. And so, yes, we were playing with all of that and trying to make it as accessible as we could to a contemporary audience.
Yeah, and I love what Sarah said about, it was interesting for us to collaborate also on what we would call syllabification, which is where we would take the Italian, and so often when things are translated, you lose the rhythm or the rhythmic integrity of what Vivaldi was writing for, and I really wanted to avoid that. But there are certain ways in which I guess like a singer feels that, and other ways in which a writer feels that. So we would sit together and look at these lines and look at the Italian as a kind of guide. And I would say to Sarah, well, no, because that syllable is stressed and he's put that stress on this note. And so we have to find a way for the stress to exist in that note. And so we had we would, and Sarah would say to me, wait, can you just go, we would do like da, 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 da. And so we would then have to come up with the right way of saying a version of what that text was saying with that rhythm. And we did that syllabification. Then I would say, actually, that's not going to sound good on that high note for a soprano on an E vowel. So we have to find it on a more round vowel. And so there was a lot of actual work that went into making the singing itself and Sarah's words come across in a way that felt natural for what Sarah was writing and that felt native to Vivaldi.
This sounds fun, like a very fun session of working together.
It was so fun. It was like Wordle combined with sonnet writing, doing a back bend, and Anthony has a harpsichord floating in his apartment. And so we would go to his apartment with the floating harpsichord. I don't really know how to describe it, but it was completely delightful.
Right. So, I mean, since you both mentioned nature, and of course nature is very important to this particular project, and of course nature is also a big theme in so many different ways, I'm wondering whether this particular work of yours has allowed you to think more, I'm sure it has, but about, your role as artists, performers, individuals who bring their work to audiences, and this particular fraught question of, what's our relationship to nature. I know it's a big question, so we could spend hours talking about it, but sort of a takeaway of this particular experience when it comes to thinking about, you artists and nature as something which you also bring forward to the audience?
I just think artists have a responsibility right now to make narratives about nature and climate because it's existential at the moment, and yet a lot of people don't feel urgently about it, or they want to go to art and kind of turn off the brain, you know, reality television or whatever. And during the pandemic, when the theaters were shut down and I was sometimes more in nature than I normally am, I just couldn't think about much else. And I don't know what to say. I mean, I felt like I wanted audiences to come to see the Four Seasons and think, well, if I want to keep listening to beautiful music, which is my birthright or what I'm interested in, then if I'm on the board of the Shell company, I need to divest from fossil fuels. So I do feel a responsibility to be thinking and writing and talking about it.
I think also we're conscientious throughout the process of talking to people who work in the political side of climate and also in climate science. And one thing that your friend sort of told us is that, and it made it into the script in one say, it's not, I mean, obviously recycling is important, but it is not enough that you recycled your water bottle, is one of the lines in Sarah's play. You know, what really will move things and move them quickly is a kind of grassroots and policy change in tandem, right? And those things tend to happen in tandem, that people work together to create some policy change or some change in the government. And what allows a normal human being who's in a theater to key into their desire to engage with this piece of news that we're being bombarded with over and over and over again, which starts to we become numb to. And that numbness is, I think, what this piece can combat. It can reopen you up to the fact that you, through emotion, that you are engaged and involved in the world. And also, I'll just say we staged one piece of this during the LA fires. And, you know, and that was this moment when everyone was all of a sudden talking about it for a minute, and then it dies away. And that piece, you know, it just felt, oh, it's so relevant. And everybody who was watching that, or when we were making that, it felt very, very powerful. So trying to maintain that sense of connection to the material, which in our current world, you know, we can get so easily pulled in many directions.
What you're saying again is also very political, in the sense that I mean, both of your remarks, it seems to me that you're kind of also arguing, and I agree personally with that, that there's something about what the arts can do, not simply by telling the story of a given topic or focusing on a specific subject matter, but really through the emotional capaciousness of the experience of art. I mean, one of the reasons why people may get more sort of attentive towards certain themes is because they get amazed by what they're experiencing in the hall, right? I mean, in the theater, or, you know, in a museum, if they're looking at works of art, there's something almost irrational, very emotional about the way in which these awareness can be brought to the audience. And I mean, it seems to me that your work tries to do that as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm not interested deeply in sort of moralistic art, or art with a kind of essay, op-ed essay kind of quote takeaway. I am interested in art that makes you feel something. And I guess Brecht would say, well, when you feel something, you're also hypnotized, and so you can't have a political engagement with a work of art. But I guess I don't totally agree with Brecht. I guess that I feel that one's emotional life, what one is drawn to, pulled towards, what moves you, creates an impression on the brain, and forces people to think/feel differently about something. And I think we change when the thought process and the emotional life are moving in tandem, as opposed to the emotional life getting cut off from a kind of cerebral reaction to something.
Right. Anthony.
I will, yeah. Also, I think we are, just to go back to time for a second, it's very hard to have any perspective in our modern world because we're constantly changing. Our mind is changing from one screen to another, or from one moment to another, different stories and all of this input. And to have a couple of hours in a theater to just be looking at one thing and to have that thing provoke certain feelings in you, I think creates perspective that is hard to get in other contexts. And when I leave a theater or a good show, sometimes I have perspective on whatever it was I was worried about earlier or thinking about earlier, whether it's to be more concerned about it or less concerned about something that might be trivial. So yeah, I think that's an important thing in our world.
Thank you. So maybe one last question before we open it up to the audience. I want to leave time for questions from the audience as well. We can maybe close on the Baroque. I mean, Baroque is a category which, in different ways, you have been, both working on, and clearly there's something appealing to both of you in the Baroque world. Again, another very capacious concept and category, sort of historically complicated, with so many biases attached to it. There's been a long time where Baroque wasn't necessarily a compliment, was not necessarily a nice thing to say about the arts. But then I think we are now in a moment where the charm of the Baroque is kind of come back in a way. There's a renewed interest in these some way sort of somewhat weird set of artistic things which come from this Baroque period. And I'm curious if you have any sort of pitch about it, responses about why the Baroque, why do you find yourself at ease within this kind of context as a source of inspiration, in terms of repertoire, given, in the case of Anthony, of course, your work with the musical repertoire from the period.
I mean, this is sort of boring, but I find Baroque music very beautiful. I mean, just in an intuitive way. And I don't know if it's the math of it, the emotional math of it that I love, but I also find it's very contemporary. And there were things I learned so much from doing this. And one thing I learned was how much control the performer has, like when you're talking about ornamenting Eurydice, that Anthony would be like this jazz master. He'd be with the band and he'd be like, do it again, but a little more, give me this, give me that. And very different to me, the relationship between the performer and the orchestra than certainly that would never have happened, in Eurydice with Matt conducting. And I love the rigor of the music, but also that there's that sort of openness in the music to improvisation in a way.
Yeah, I think I love that as well. And I think that there is something about Baroque music in its form in opera, which is very much about psychology as opposed to plot. And that's really interesting, as we get into verismo and other kinds of opera where you're really focused on plot at all moments. In the Baroque, all the plot is dealt with in the recits, and then the arias are these long, extended sort of drills into the character's brain and thought. And that, to me, is what is the most human thing, as opposed to plot. It's not trying to take you out of yourself. It's trying to put you deeper into yourself. And I like that about the Baroque. And the other thing that occurs to me is that the Baroque happens at a moment when, there has been theater and there has been music, but they haven't quite been put together in the same way. And later on, there's all different kinds of ways of mass production of books and, other things. But it's this special moment in which I think of it as like the Netflix of its moment. When people are all coming to the theater and they're seeing all of these different elements come together with the music and the theater and all of it, and they are there for 4 hours sort of binge watching, coming together, and there's a special energy to that I want to sort of recapture.
Thank you for bringing up this question of the psychological dimension of it, because it also has to do with another word which we haven't really used tonight, but which I find extremely interesting when I think about the Baroque, which is allegory. And, the kind of allegorical dimension of so many of these kind of things, particularly, the sacred repertoire would be a very good area to look at. But even the notion that we bring on stage in a Baroque opera, not only real characters, but also allegorical ones, allegorical personifications. I saw elements of allegory, of course, in your Seasons project, even if the characters were meant to be human, but they were all types, right, in a way. So there was something very human about them, but also something more abstract. And these dynamics between allegorical, abstract, and the embodied emotional dimension of what they were doing on stage seemed to capture, at least to my mind, some of the tricky and interesting things of the Baroque. I don't know whether you thought about this sort of allegorical possible way of framing.
A bit, yeah, and that was beautifully said. I mean, there's a character in the opera called the Cosmic Weatherman, and my notion of it was that he was a little bit like the sun god in a way, but that all he could be in the present moment was the cosmic weatherman who was so tired of reporting on the weather that he had to quit. But at the end, the sun kind of comes down the way it would in a Baroque opera, and the elements take over. And I think I'm always interested in the theater in that line between allegory and, the granularity of psychological roundedness, I guess.
And everyone is a little bit, the characters don't actually have names. They're called the poet and the painter and, the choreographer and the farmer. And so they're all a little bit of an archetype or an avatar or an allegory, which is really interesting. But I also realized I should say, if you're wondering what we're talking about with this whole piece, I can say in advance of tomorrow's announcement that you can come see it in Philadelphia at Opera Philadelphia, and you should come see it so that you can see what we're talking about.
That's excellent news. Excellent news. Fantastic. Well, on this note, I think we can certainly open it up to questions from the audience. We do have some time, and I invite anybody to ask questions. We have a microphone sort of going around.
Just for Anthony, is your what you're wearing, is that from something you've been in? Is that a costume?
It's not. It's just it's a Baroque looking garment, in fact. But
great.
yeah, I
Great.
collect them whenever I find them. Thank you.
Anthony has amazing fashion. Every day was a treat.
I have this impression that the Baroque religious music was sort of more expansive in the audience it reached, that maybe it reached the middle classes, maybe the lower classes. And I see Baroque, secular music, operas, the more high culture part of Baroque, to be limited to the top 1% or whatever we call them today. Do you have any thoughts on that observation?
The truth is that it began that way, in that opera began in the courts of the nobility and the public had no access. But by 1639, opera is taken public, and not like a company, but but it goes to the public in Venice. And what you have, and it's done with an opera called The Coronation of Poppaea, which is really about class in an interesting way. And from that moment on, there is actually a reversal in which the church music that's being written, you have these people like Bach and Handel and Purcell who are getting jobs from nobility to write for their particular church. And so the liturgical music actually becomes more for the 1%. Meanwhile, in the opera house, what we would now call the orchestra section had no seats. It was a big mosh pit, and people brought their chicken legs and they brought their buckets. And this isn't to say the nobility weren't there. The nobility bought the boxes like real estate sometimes and would move their own furniture in and have their dinner there. And in fact, if you go in Naples to the opera house, they still have mirrors on the back wall of the boxes. And I asked why there were these mirrors on the back walls of the box. And they said, oh, well, because people who were eating dinner, if they had their back to the show, they would watch it in the mirror because they would sit around the table and eat dinner. The opera house, and if you wonder why there are curtains, when you were done with dinner, if you wanted to engage in anything illicit, you could close the curtain. It was an array of all different people.
This is how the Met could make their money back, is to have
I agree.
furniture, curtains.
I agree. Well, we'll work on it. Buy your box.
Yeah,
like a piece of real estate. Lease it for 100 years. So I think, to answer your question, certainly people connected to the religious music, but it's only in modern times that the Messiah, the Messiah really began as a piece of theater more than anything. But Bach's music has become so ubiquitous more in the modern time, I think, than it was then. And Bach was writing that music weekly because he got a commission, or that was his job. He was paid, and so he would write something out quickly and deliver it for the service at the church where he was the kammermaster.
Hi, this is for Anthony. Opera has become so athletic. There seems to be a lot more athleticism involved, versus 30 years ago when, Pavarotti and whoever, Joan Sutherland, would like sort of park and bark, right? So just your production of Orfeo with all those stairs up and down, and I'm always amazed at how people are like singing like from the floor and getting up, and how do you work out, and how does everybody account for all this like amazing physical energy that you have to put out?
I think that I make an effort to really, be physical and to make sure that I'm in good shape. But I think that there was an era, at least, when people felt very precious about the voice. And I can only talk about my own journey, which is that I've built up a kind of stamina where I feel less precious, I find, than most opera singers do. Either because I've let go of fear or because I have cultivated through careful trial and error, the limit of what I can do vocally. And I'm always trying to push that limit for myself in order to create more points of access for people, I guess. I think 30 years ago, opera was selling out all over. And people were going because they knew a little more, they knew voices, they liked the idea of it, it had more cultural capital. And in this moment, when it doesn't have any cultural capital and Taylor Swift has taken it, you know what I mean? What point of access are we creating? It doesn't have to be a physical thing, but that's certainly one way that people relate to it in a more contemporary way, like Sarah was saying.
Well, and Anthony does bike a lot. And if you want to see him sing on the floor a very athletic aria for 7 minutes, 9 minutes, Jelly Dough is about that long. And then snow is coming down and he's singing curled into a ball on the floor. And I was so worried the fake snow was going to get in your mouth. And in fact, it did one time.
I think perhaps the most physical performance I've ever seen was you last year on Little Island. And I cannot, I came away totally gobsmacked by that. There was something of dubious, questionable taste with the, well, it's, going down and then you disappeared for 20 minutes, whatever. And I can't imagine how you did that for how many days was it? Was it the whole month? Was it 3 weeks? It was, could you speak about the physicality? I mean, I saw the physicality, but could you speak how you trained for that? What did you do? How did you relax your voice? I mean, you've obviously technique, but how did you relax your voice in between performances?
When I was doing I have a voice teacher, Joan Patno Yarnell, and she's very dramatic. And when I was singing with Justin Vivian Bond, who sings not in a classical way at all, and my voice teacher really only thinks about the classical voice. And so she said something to Justin Vivian Bond, which I loved, but Justin Vivian Bond, of course, was very offended by, which was she said, "You know what I love about your voice? You will it." And I think that is really like there's technique and there's will. And you have to cultivate will. Like it doesn't come, it's not just like a natural force that is in you. You have to actually train for it like a marathon. And so when I was working on Little Island and I started trying to do it, I could not make it through the show. I just could not do it. And I guess fundamentally there's like a little optimist inside me who says if you keep trying, you'll find a way to make it through, and you'll, create calluses on your vocal cord or whatever it might be to make it through. And so there were always, little places I found to save and pace myself and, figure that out. But also by virtue of just doing it more and more, I got used to it. And it was like training for a marathon in that way. And so I encourage you all to cultivate your will.
For a little bit of context, this was this beautiful show where Anthony was playing all the roles in the Le Nozze di Figaro, and it was done this past summer, and it was really something amazing, and it was, yeah. And as you know, it's also, of course, a fairly long opera, and even with some cuts, I mean, it sort of stays long and pretty demanding in many ways. We do have time for a couple of questions. I saw some.
I have a question for Sarah that I want to ask, which is that I've always wanted to ask and I never have. When your writing seems so essential, like it's the core of everything, and everything is very meaningful, but also quite simple. And I'm wondering what kind of discipline is involved in that? Like, is there a lot of cutting away, or is there a lot of thought before you put something on paper? And how do you get something that's so clear? And what's the process to arrive there?
Well, I do love to cut, but I also think the process of writing poetry since I was young has helped with that distillation process, and even practicing forms like haiku or sonnet, you have just the amount of syllables that you have. And that as a practice appeals to me in the same way that meditation appeals to me, and things arising out of silence appeal to me. And I don't know, I'm from the Midwest where sometimes we're like a people of few words. Not all of us, but I do love work that is has words of great purpose, but not necessarily fancy. Like in the same way that I like food that's like delicious but not fancy, and I love a good broth that's been distilled, and I guess I feel that way about poetry too.
That's such a beautiful way to put it, right? Because it also shows the amount of work which gets into the process, and it's really fascinating to hear always, how writers manage to do that and to reach that kind of clarity and, you know, the sort of essential nature of the text, which Anthony was describing. I had one final question, I think, which is now sort of flipping out of my mind. Yes, which had to do with voice, because of course, you know, since this series is about voice, I would like to close maybe asking you, well, first of all, what's your relationship? It might sound like a sort of a dull question, especially to a singer, what's your relationship with your voice? But really what I'm interested in is whether, you know, for instance, Sarah, when you write and when you read, are you the kind of writer and reader who hears voices while you do that? And for Anthony, of course, you work with your voice all the time. I'm wondering whether there are moments when you manage to leave it out, either in reading or, you know, sort of thinking about things, if you see what I mean, given the amount of space which voice has in your life.
I was rehearsing last night for a concert I'm doing at National Sawdust in a couple of weeks. And I'm singing some really unconventional repertoire. And I was trying to fit my voice into a place that it didn't feel like it should go, and find how to shape my voice to that music or the music to my voice. And I think it's very interesting to understand what is innate and what is under your control. Do you know what I mean? Or you can manipulate in some way. And how to maintain a core of that integrity of your authentic voice, but be able to have the maximum palette of colors. There's a lot, as you go through that, I find that I navigate a lot of norms. You know, this is beautiful and this is not beautiful. This is correct singing and this is incorrect singing. And so I'm thinking about, you know, and doing The Marriage of Figaro, I remember a lot of people loved it, and then you get one critic who hates it and says it in such a vile way, and you think, have I used my voice to violate a norm? And is that the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do? So I'm more interested in pushing on the boundaries of that rather than trying to move my voice closer to some sort of ineffable ideal of beauty.
So beautiful. I mean, for playwrights, I think there are two kinds of voices. There's the authorial voice, whatever it is that the amalgam of voices in your play, whatever that amalgam is, the consciousness of you that produces it. And what I tell my students, I have two amazing playwriting students here tonight. I have had students in the past who've worried, what is my voice, or do I have a voice? And I usually say, please don't think about it. Don't be self-conscious about it, because I think hearing your own voice is like smelling your own smell. It's almost impossible. Or trying to tickle yourself is almost impossible. You just can't do it. So I think I try not to think about my own voice when I'm writing, but try to kind of conjure the voices of characters, and when they speak, to just keep following them. And I think, you know, a real pleasure of working on this piece with Anthony, who sings like an angel unicorn. The unicorns don't sing, but like a very is having your voice in my head and waking up at 3 a.m. and hearing those melodies in my head. And I'm really interested in the relationship between the word and song, and when does the word attain the status of song? When does language get vaulted into music? So it was deeply satisfying to work together on that.
Right. Well, on this beautiful image of the singing unicorn, I think we should close our conversation. And I would like to thank Sarah Ruhl and Anthony Roth Costanzo for joining us tonight. It's been such a pleasure. Thanks very much. And thank you all for being with us.